Okay, we're good. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to her and she can add to her introductions, but we're happy to have Krisha with us.
Like John said, I'm Krisha Geffert. So I originally hail from Wyoming. I live in Wisconsin now. I'm really fortunate to have the best job in the world. I would have been in a bigger hurry to graduate college if I would have known that this was a career and I could actually get paid to do the job that I do. I truly love it. I did spell my name wrong on the initial portion of the presentation. My email is Krisha, because that is my first full name. I just noticed that.
Great.
I work for the best nutrition company there is, guys, but this is unbiased, and please feel free to ask questions. I'm more comfortable and in a normal situation have the audience here, so feel free to engage and interrupt me at any time to ask questions. That's kind of the fun of this whole deal, is to get to know you. If there were a few of you in the audience, I can see your names. I'd sure pick on you if I could, but I can't because I can't see you. So as we get started with management and from the feed side, I know that you've had some people on to talk about selection, and that truly is really, really important. So genetics, management, nutrition, and showmanship. I think those are the four things that are part of the equation to having a successful show pig project. And obviously genetics is fairly near and dear to my heart as my family raises show pigs, and I cannot hammer home enough that we have to start with a good one. Colby Hales did the selection portion. You guys, if you didn't get to see that, go back and visit through the selection. I have a livestock judging background as well. Wyoming is still awesome in that regard. And if you guys have the opportunity to take advantage of one of those judging programs, please do. Warren Crawford, who is actually at the university now, is someone that was influential in my career getting started. He took us around to all those 4-H judging contests. And then I had Keith Horniker, again, someone in Wyoming that's still really prevalent, was one of my judging coaches in high school. Without those avenues growing up, first of all, it paid for my college, which is awesome. I got scholarship money because I had good grades and was part of that livestock judging program. And then ultimately, it's the reason I have the job I do. And it's played huge into the raising the show pigs, because you have to start with good ones. Then management comes into play, and I understand you'll have more on that. And we'll kick some of that management type stuff in. Nutrition is huge, and showmanship. So we can pay $5,000 for the best pig there is. We can mismanage them and not handle the nutrition portion successfully and be really disappointed with how we do. And then showmanship, obviously, if we can't get them shown in the end, that's going to be kind of a damper on our project as well. So good ones are bred, but champions are fed. I said that I work for a nutrition company, so obviously I'm fairly partial to that one, but I do not care what nutrition company you guys choose. Make sure that you invest in a good nutrition program from beginning to end, because we can take those really good genetics and we cannot reach that full genetic potential because we haven't done the research there. They are made at home, and I believe in this statement because that hard work at home every day, making those decisions from a management standpoint, is extremely important, but shows are also lost at the show. And so we'll talk about some of that management stuff from the nutrition side. Also, feeding manageable numbers may depend on your particular family. There are some families that have 5, 7 kids, and your manageable number might be different than what my manageable number at home is. I have a child that's pretty active and busy. I'm gone a lot, so our manageable number is not 10. I cannot sit here and tell you that we can feed them appropriately, get them ready for the show with that high a number. So you have to decide what those numbers are for you. If you get the opportunity to know who your judge is ahead of time, that's kind of an interesting thing, because from a selection standpoint, there are things that I personally like. Those of you that know me, that I'm crazy about head and ears on a pig. So one that looks like he's been chasing parked car doors, no matter how good he is, the rest of him. If there's one that's better fronted and cooler looking and has all of those qualities, I personally am probably going to take the better looking one. So knowing that priority ahead of time as we feed into, or we work into some feeding things, or just as far as the pig that you select, can kind of be important. So the most important nutrient there is water. I cannot stress this enough. I've been to the project visit before where we walk up to the pen and those pigs run to the other end of the pen and they're hitting the pen and they want to get out really, really bad. And I say to the mom, I said, has he not spent time with them? And she said, no, we don't want him to get attached. Well, guys, that's what this project is about. So we need to get attached to these things so we know their normal habits. But I was there because this particular pig was not gaining. And as I was standing there, I noticed that he would walk up to the water, which happened to be one of those barrels with a nipple on it, and he sucked and sucked and sucked on that nipple. So I imagine that the water level in that barrel with the nipple had gone down, but the amount of energy that pig was burning to get that water source, and if he ever truly got enough of it, was the question. And so that can be a huge limiter in the way our pigs gain. So provide fresh, clean water. It sounds so simple, but that's one of the bigger mistakes that we make. I think it's also really important, if you're going to get to that next level in terms of being a pretty successful feeder, that we've trained those hogs to drink in the manner that we're going to take them to the show and drink. So if we're bucket watering at a show, we need to have taken the time to have introduced that bucket prior to leaving for that show, so the hogs are consuming it. As you can see, those pigs are still comprised of 50% water at showtime. So there's a fair amount of fluids there. And if we aren't paying attention to it, it can be pretty disappointing in the way those hogs are gonna look in the end. Anybody have questions about the watering side of things? And Dawn, feel free to interrupt me. I talk kind of fast, so if there's anybody that might have a question there.
We're good in the chat box. Nobody's there in the chat box, so we're good.
Awesome, sounds good. So water is the number one most critical nutrient as far as that's concerned, so make sure we pay attention. So I always ask this question, are a grape and a raisin the same thing? And I guess depending on if you're in California or not, you know a lot more about grapes than some of us, and that's one of the areas I cover. But truly, a grape and a raisin originated the same. So they started as a grape, and a certain amount of that is dehydration. So the grape and the raisin are a really good example to use throughout our nutrition talk, and that's why I put this picture up fairly soon. So I talked about that hydration factor as you go into the show. If you've ever heard the judge say that pig is stale and high in his chine, well, a lot of times that's a factor of his level of hydration. It can also be just his sheer maturity. And then it can also be caused by lack of an inclining plane of nutrition heading into that show. So our muscular tissue sits around the skeleton like this. If you can see me on the video on the side, his chine bone would be in between my pink fingernails right now. So as that grape or raisin dehydrates, that cellular tissue sinks down, and then suddenly we have that bone called the chine that sticks up. So make sure that we've paid attention to that from an electrolyte standpoint, just training them to drink. And then we want to have hogs that are an appropriate age. Sad but true, as we get older, our skin starts to sag around our skeleton. Same things happens on the hogs if they're too old. And if we haven't weighed and paid enough attention to weight, that can also play into that freshness as we go to the show. So proteins and amino acids are interesting in swine diets, and I don't spend a whole lot of time, especially for those of you that are exhibitors, going into the science behind the feed, because that's truly one thing. If you have paid attention and invested in a formulated show feed for show pigs, that you don't have to really worry too much about. And it is the reason, though, that I do encourage you to do that, no matter what the company is, Lidner, Showtech, Showrite, Purina, one of those companies that has some research behind it. Because pigs have no crude protein requirement, they do have some requirements for limiting amino acids, like the lysine would be one in particular that you see a lot on those labels. So if you're trying to make your own rations at home and we don't utilize corn and soybean as those sources, we can be deficient in those areas. And so again, they're not going to gain at appropriate levels, which can kind of become concerning as far as what you're spending on the ingredients and then what's going out the other end and what's actually getting converted to gain. So I've hammered it home that a sound nutrition program is really, really critical, because that's how we are going to get the most out of the genetics of those pigs. So just because they're the best one at sale time, or they have the genetic potential to be the best one, we can sure mess them up in a hurry by not managing them right from a nutritional standpoint. So I talked about a complete formulated show feed already, but technology is one thing that I think is very, very interesting in the feed world right now. there are technologies that are utilized in the commercial industry that may not be what are in the show feeds at this exact time, because their actual goal is to optimize lean muscle, skeletal tissue growth, and get them there at the fastest possible time. Whereas in the show side, we're gearing towards some things like fill and body and bloom that they may not be paying attention to. And then the other thing is we have things like nucleotides, or words that you might hear, or wholesale yeast, maybe some extracts. Those things are going to be utilized to keep the gut healthy from a natural standpoint. Ben talked to you guys about medications, so hopefully you guys covered what feed grade medications are available. I will tell you that none of the floor stocked items for most feed companies require a VFD. So they are all medicated usually with a product called BMD. This has no withdrawal, and it also does not require a VFD. It is going to still help with some of that gut health and prevention of some of those issues that may cause things like diarrhea, but it does not require a VFD. There are drugs you can utilize for prevention within the feed, things like CTC and lincomycin. Personally, at home, we've got quite a few sows. Even in our starter feeds at this point, I'm pretty confident in our vaccination protocol and our environment. And environment is hugely, hugely important in this. I'm confident enough that we don't even put CTC in our baby pig feed. That's a personal decision, but you certainly are more than welcome to. It is going to require that vet script, and also probably a fairly hefty minimum order as a feed company to get it. But utilizing some of these other technologies like CitraStim is one that we have. Biomass is another company's, and those are going to be wholesale yeast. So that yeast cell actually gets brought into the body because it's a whole cell, and it tricks it into upregulating the immune system. So anytime we can keep the tissue and the gut healthy, it actually should lead to those pigs being healthier, probably less incidence of respiratory. I cannot make that claim, but I know that research has showed that by keeping the gut healthy and keeping those hogs on feed, we can usually ensure that they're going to be healthier. Cost is not an issue. There might be a parent or two that reads that and says, yes, cost is an issue. So we need to determine what your family goals are here, definitely. But if we're talking about $4 a bag difference for those fixed formula feeds that are balanced rations, in the whole scope of things, if it's going to take, 12 to 15 bags of feed, that's less than $100. So I know that in a time where we're really cost conscious, that is still money, but $100 and your project making weight and actually getting to sell at the county fair versus not spending that extra $100, being underweight and going through all of the purchasing of the product and feeding them the whole time and not being able to sell at that county fair, the cheap can come out expensive. So that's definitely something to pay attention to. As far as your equipment needed for feeding, you want to elevate that feeder. So from a selection standpoint, hopefully Colby was sure to convey to you that we want hogs cool looking right now. It's kind of a hot button, so tall fronted and extended up through their front end. We also want to keep them sound structured. So by elevating a feeder, we can help with those things. If a hog has to tip forward and eat down off of the ground, that can put extra stress on his structure on the front portion and the rear of his skeleton. It also builds muscles kind of in a funny way that might bulk up his front end. So you want to get that feeder at an appropriate level where it's easy for him to eat. So if all you have is a self feeder or whatever it is, you can even put it on blocks to achieve that. And I'm not saying he needs to get on his tippy toes and reach up, so just at a comfortable level so his head is at an even keel to go ahead and eat. We talked about water a second ago, but if you have the opportunity to build some kind of water with a nipple or make it foolproof, mud holes are actually probably not the best thing for pigs. They're kind of a breeding ground for bugs and that kind of stuff. Even though in our mind we think it helps regulate temperature, we're probably better off to give them shade to do that than we are to make that mud hole. Also, incidents where I see pigs that have been injured or packing a leg, there's usually 3 or 4 of them in a pen with one of those big mud holes, and they're just constantly fighting for dominance. So they'll come by and sideswipe somebody else, and then ultimately we have one on 3 legs. We don't know how it happened, but sometimes that can be the cause as well. So pigs will spill a water pan if we're just pan watering. So if we could get a nipple on even the tube or the barrel, whatever you can do there can be advantageous. As you get into some of these later feeding phases, which we're headed into, the clip-on fence feeder is really, really nice because we can adjust the height of that, and then we can measure that feed out to get it in there. A scale is really, really handy. I know that it's not doable for everyone. Actually, what I use here at home is a vet scale is what it is for those larger dogs. I can't remember what it cost when we purchased it, like $250. And you can get those hogs trained to come onto that scale for feed. It really isn't that hard, or moms or dads, you can kind of build it into an alley. So it doesn't have to be a $2,000 Paul scale. It can be a cheaper investment than that to be able to weigh, but it's really hard to manage that weight aspect if we don't know where we're at. So we like to divide the feeding phases into 3 different phases. So for me, 1 would be from the time of purchase to 125 pounds. Most of you hopefully have purchased your hogs at this point if you have those August county fairs. Some of you that are into September, maybe not quite yet, but are getting ready to. So I'm imagining you're purchasing those hogs around 50 pounds. Some of them might be even approaching 70 to 100 by now. So we're in the phase 1, so we'll start out at that and then go on to phase 2 and 3. So in that first initial phase of feeding, we're going to recommend that you keep feed in front of those hogs, so at free choice. That doesn't necessarily mean have the big self feeder and just dump a bag in, albeit that is convenient if you think they're going to run out of feed in between. But getting to know those hogs' natural eating habits, most every time you go out to feed, they're going to jump up and come to see you. So that activity is going to stimulate them to get up and come and eat. It's a pretty good way to miss sickness in a pig if we're feeding out of one of those self-feeders that we just dump the whole bag in, because we're not as diligent as going out to check. Whereas if we have to feed a couple times a day, it helps to notice that natural habit, and if the pig lays around. So we want to be sure to treat those things initially so they don't mature into something worse. So keep that feeder full. If you have the clip-on feeder, just keep feed in front of them in that initial phase to offer that genetic potential for skeletal tissue and muscle growth. Also, make sure that we're cleaning the bottoms of those feeders out. Pigs are pigs, so if they defecate in that feeder, a lot of times we'll think, gosh, they're not eating quite as much. Well, they may have gone in the corner over there of that feeder and not be using it. So make sure we're paying attention and cleaning that out. So for a receiving ration, I'm going to recommend at that 50-pound mark that we're feeding something that's a little higher protein and higher fat. So that's going to help with that transition from that warm barn that they were in. A lot of the chip barns that people utilize are 65 to 75 degrees. They may have heat lamps in there as well. So we want to keep that protein up because of that lean muscle tissue and skeletal development, but we also want to keep the fat just a shot higher as well to help with that initial transition to provide some more energy as they maybe go to a little bit cooler climate. I would make sure as you're bringing those hogs home, guys, if you have the opportunity to safely use a heat lamp, please do. If it's not an option, then building some sort of enclosure so that they can make a little bit tighter space. If you're outside or an environment that you can't heat, straw is good to keep that temperature a little bit warmer, but do realize that there's a certain amount of dust that comes with that straw also, so really need to pay attention to that respiratory as we make that transition. So pigs that are bloomy at 50 pounds, and so by that I mean have quite a bit of muscle shape, they're starting to get stouter and have a little more dimension to them, and we know that we need to bring the protein down just a little. Something like a 19% protein with 4% fat would be good in that initial phase. At this point, we're going to make some decisions to manage fat and muscle composition, and we want to use research-proven products to do that. So I always like to relate human nutrition to swine nutrition, and I think of how I personally would treat my diet to make necessary changes to the way I appear physically, and I would relate it back to the same thing you would want to do with hogs. Also realizing that genetics are different amongst people as well. Just within my family, my mother is really hard doing. For those of you that have met and seen my mother, she weighs probably 98 pounds soaking wet. That's because we could stand her in a corner and she'd be busy, but she's naturally just got a higher metabolism and is a little bit harder doing. So I would relate her to one of those pigs that is the same way. So from a diet standpoint, I know that I'm probably going to need to push more fat to that kind of hog. I'm going to need to bring that protein down so that they deposit more condition. Managing muscle is one of the more critical things that we do in those in that early stage, even because we do not want to continue to push really high levels of protein to hogs that we know are going to be too stout muscled. If we've got a hog that we know is the opposite of that, so we've got Arnold Schwarzenegger the pig, and then we've got Squishy the couch potato. So the hog that lives on the couch and has no muscle shape, he's going to have a top similar to the shape that I'm making with my hands. He's not going to have a whole lot of expression. So I know that we want him to continue to develop that muscle shape that stands up around his skeleton. So I'm going to keep him on something more like a 20% protein to get him to develop more muscle shape. And then that fat at a lower level, like something like a 3.5. Once we get that muscle closer to where we're desiring, then we can bring that protein level down. So again, just think of it from a person's standpoint. If I'm going to train to be a professional couch potato and be Porky the pig who eats nothing but Twinkies, potato chips, and all of those great junk foods, well, most of those lack protein, right? So we're going to bring those protein levels down in pigs that are too heavy muscled and stout, and we're going to take them up on tag level for the pigs that need more muscle shape. So again, if we have one that is too stout muscled and we know he's going to have a hard time depositing that condition by his indicators, we're going to put him on something like an 18% protein with a higher fat level of about 7%. So here's an example of a pig. I wouldn't call this one necessarily not heavy enough muscled, but he's one that probably is a good candidate for a 20%. He's pretty good made, and he doesn't have just a ton of definition down his top, so he could probably stay on a 20% in this initial phase of feeding at about 50 pounds. Whereas this would be his polar opposite. We can see this thing has tons and tons of muscle shape. I'm imagining if she gets out and moves, it's pretty tight bound, so she's kind of like Arnold the pig. I know on that one, we aren't going to want to continue to feed that lean muscle tissue growth. We're going to kind of want to start to tone it down. So definitely onto an 18% at least in this initial phase. So again, Colby probably touched on the structural side of things in relation to muscle shape. This gilt from behind is really big hips, and then where her structure hits from behind is also right on the corners of where her muscle shape is. So that tells me on her, if I continue to push that really high protein and cause more lean muscle tissue and development, she could eventually get outside of her scale from a skeletal standpoint by pushing too much protein to her in these early phases. That's really hard to correct as we get further down the road. So we want to be mindful of that early and just kind of tone it down and not continue to add to the problem. We want to avoid feeding really high fat levels from 60 to 100 pounds. Really high fat levels would be 7% fat plus a top dressing additional fat. We would not want to make those decisions at that point. We want to start with the small inclusion levels. So tag level on a top dress fat product, one would be more fat. I think Sumo is another company's. There are several of those that we can top dress additional fat. We don't want to feed real high levels of that in the initial phase. So 2 ounces would be plenty in that particular situation. Do we have any questions so far, Don? Nope. All right. Everybody's quiet. I like the ones of you I can see. Are you doing homework over there too? No? Okay. So as we get into phase 2 of feeding, this is where at 125 pounds, we're going to make some determinations as far as utilizing and doing the math, which is the next slide that I'll go to from a management standpoint. This is where we're going to start measuring how much we're putting into that fence clip feeder. So I would say 5 to 6 pounds per head per day. So 2.5 to 3 morning and night would be a good time to do that at about 125 pounds. So we're going to, we have a feed cup that's really nice. A lot of companies do. If you don't have access to those, to be able to weigh those on a scale is really nice to know exactly the consistency between all products of what you're actually feeding. I've been in the situation before where somebody says they're feeding 1 scoop. Well, their scoop was not the same as mine, and so inevitably when they thought they were holding a pig, they were actually feeding 8 pounds when they thought they were feeding 3. So you need to weigh that in the form of pounds, and then we need to adjust that amount of feed no sooner than 125 pounds, because we would not limit your guys' diets at this stage of development, because we'd have some pretty good consequences on your genetic potential for your skeletal development and lean muscle tissue growth. Also, your health we would put at risk. So I guess this is the slide I was going for. That we need to make some determinations as far as weight is concerned. So this math, a lot of different people do it different ways. I think if you start out from the very beginning of your project at 50 pounds, you should take the number of days to that show and multiply it by somewhere around 2. During the lifetime of the project, though, if we start out at the very, very beginning, it's probably closer to 175 to 19. The averages will say on show pig genetics. So for argument's sake, let's say we have 105 days from now until the 1st of August county fairs. So if we multiply that number, 105, we multiply it times 2, we get what? Can't ask you guys questions because you're all muted. So that we get 210 pounds then, right? And I'm the girl who didn't spell my name right on the beginning, so I'll double check that. So 210 pounds. So what that number means is that's how much weight we're theoretically going to gain between now and the 1st of August. If I counted my days right, and I rounded up to 30 on most of those months. So actually go through the calendar and count those days. So an ideal endpoint for a market hog all depends on his individual build, his individual type and kind. If he has the genetic potential and the skeletal development, a 280-pound hog, if your county fair allows that size, is probably close to ideal anymore, 275. But not every pig is going to get to 275 pounds. If he's short in his cannon bone, from a selection standpoint, hopefully you guys remember what that is. He's really jammed up front, like he's been chasing parked car doors, and he's really short-bodied. He probably is not ever going to reach 275 pounds, so his ideal weight is probably going to be closer to somewhere around 265. So let's, for argument's sake, take 275 minus 210. That leaves us with 65 pounds. So that number should tell you today what that hog should weigh in somewhere in the neighborhood of. Now, please don't panic if you're at a different stage than that. If you're weighing 100 pounds, not the end of the world. Once you get to 125, though, you need to do that equation again, and that might be the determination and the time to start doing some things like holding those pigs just a shot more. In that second phase of feeding, from a management standpoint, we should definitely have tamed them down by now and start to work those pigs. I know that will be a whole other section as far as management and showmanship in the show box is concerned. And then we need to start, hopefully, if you're able, to weigh those pigs weekly just to kind of see where we're at, and then give us a determination and sort of a roadmap for what's yet to come. So there's that slide again, and I did it for you 2 different ways, and you can use that as you move forward. As we get into the third phase, so that's after 200 pounds. So hopefully we've done some management. If we have, this is where you need to be aware of what you guys have as far as genetics, because if we have a red hog that's breed slogan is "we grow on you," it's a Duroc, right? So we know that Durocs are known for their growth ability. If we have one of those that's really big early on, we're going to want to pay extra close attention to that, because he's probably going to continue that gain and even increase and accelerate toward the end. So we want to have managed, hopefully, to be in a good position as we hit this third phase, which is 200 pounds. So in the last phase of feeding, we need to make some critical determinations, like things like, do we want to use Paline? And for those of you that don't know what Paline is, it's a product that is designed to increase that average daily gain. So that tells me if I need to push a hog, it can be beneficial. It also is going to cause that nutrition to be more heavily deposited as muscle shape and pull from the fat. So less fat deposition and more lean muscle tissue growth. Paline is FDA regulated to be fed just the last 21 days. So you can't feed it any longer than that. One thing to bear in mind is protein is the carrier that makes your Paline work. So you notice on here, I say it needs to be fed a minimum of 16% crude protein. So if you have been trying to soften Arnold the pig in those initial feeding phases, so that pig that's really ripped up and super heavy muscled, and we've put him on something like a 14.5 protein feed, and we finally got him too soft. So in this last feeding phase, we decide, heck, now it's time to try to muscle him up again. Well, we can't keep him on that same 14% feed and expect our Paline to work. So Paline needs to be fed with at least 16% protein. So you can top dress some things to increase the protein, but make sure that you pay attention there. Paline is completely legal. There's absolutely no withdrawal. It's utilized in commercial feed settings, so no negative effect whatsoever on carcass. If you have a situation where you need to gain more weight, I like to call the last 30 days of any feeding phase crisis management, because that's where I get the phone call that we have 10 days left and we need to gain 30 pounds. So I just told you, most hogs are only going to gain 2. In 10 days, that's not the most realistic. However, it can be done if we add something like Paline. And in a situation where you guys need to push a pig to weight, that's where we need to feed multiple times a day versus just dumping that feed into a self-feeder. So by feeding multiple times a day, I talked earlier about how that activity stimulates those hogs to get up and go eat. So feeding multiple times a day will achieve that more easily than if we just were to feed them out of a self-feeder.
Krisha, there's a question that says, can you go back a slide? So I wonder if it's back to that one before you go on.
That one?
Yeah, I'm thinking that slide. So.
Yeah, is that the one you guys wanted to look at? And so just take your number of days till the fair and multiply them by, if you want to be optimistic, multiply them by 2. If you want to factor in for maybe some sickness, because it can happen, not ideal weight gain, then I would go more like the 1.75 to get your math there. But
so Krisha, if people are looking at that slide, there's a question that's maybe connected to this, is that they wanted you to review one more time what the what is the ideal show weight if in proper final condition at the end? So what's that ideal weight? I know you went over that, but if you can review that one more time.
Absolutely. So all of that depends on each individual pig. So depending on what his growth indicators tell you, if he's really short-bodied and doesn't look like he can get as big and tall, just like the difference in height and things like that in people, it's going to lay the foundation for the amount of mature weight they can handle. I would say ideally for a pig that is modern in his look, he's neat-fronted and he's long-bodied, 275 pounds would be a good target to shoot for. We used to say 250. Things have gotten bigger since then, so I'd say 270, 275, somewhere in that neighborhood.
And then that smaller frame pig should weigh how much?
All depending. If he's really that small framed, I mean, you want to make it over your minimums, but 240 might be all the bigger he's going to get without depositing quite a bit of condition. 265 might be his ideal. They're each going to kind of tell you that by those growth indicators. And that's where I would suggest seeking out the help of your breeder developing that relationship with them, somebody from a nutrition company to send pictures to, or your extension and 4-H agents to help with that, FFA advisors as well. That brings me to another point. Guys, as you're seeking out help, there are a lot of different ways to be successful feeding. My particular style might be different than the guy that owns Ottenwalter Show Pig style, for example. He might want to push lots of fat initially and get those pigs really bloomy, and then in the end square up that muscle shape. I might like to keep them leaner to begin with and put more muscle shape on their skeleton, and then push some fats later to bloom them up in the end. So stay with the person that you start with for that help, and then kind of stay with one particular feeding program instead of yo-yoing around, because those hogs will be more efficient that way, and you'll reach a target goal there better as well. So we talked about paling. Paling is not for every hog. Initially, when paling kind of, people had some sour things maybe to say about it, it was because they went to the county fair and they saw a really tight-made, bad-structured hog, and they just assumed they'd been fed too much paling. Chances are those were bad genetics, but paling is not to be fed to those bad genetics, because it's going to just make them worse where they are. So that selection is huge, huge key in being successful at feeding, so that you know what you have versus where you need to go. So in this last feeding phase as well is where we're going to make the determination as far as utilizing top dresses. Some people may just want to keep your feeding program as simple as possible, and then some of you, depending on your goals, might aspire to win the state fair or win the National Western Stock Show, and that's where these top dresses are going to come into play. There are top dresses to enhance muscle shape. There are top dresses to enhance fat cover. There are top dresses that will help with rib and body. There are also all kinds of opportunities on the top dress side to feed things to help with gut health. So each of those feeding companies has a different protocol there. As you guys go into show as well, I talked about electrolytes when I used the grape versus raisin example. Make sure that you're utilizing some kind of electrolyte with that. And also, there are top dress items that have really readily available energy to put back into that cellular tissue to keep hogs fresh and muscular. And there is definitely a difference, and I can tell visually the individuals who have done that as we've gotten to the fair versus those who haven't. So here's an example of two pigs. Obviously, the one on the left, he just doesn't look like he has any muscle shape, versus the one on the right who looks like he would be that tighter, more wound up, bound up muscle shape. So these hogs are going to need to be managed completely different, especially in that last 30 days. I'm probably going to feed the hog on the left a higher protein type feed. He looks to me like a really good candidate to be fed paling at a 9-gram level. And he's one that I'm going to want to keep the fats down on as well, because to me he looks like he's going to deposit some condition. The one on the right, with that kind of muscle structure, we're going to want to keep the protein level down in that feed. We're probably going to want to top dress some additional fat on top of feeding a higher fat feed. And he would be a good candidate for some filler type products that contain things like beet pulp and additional fibers to help body him down and give him more shape to that rib cage. The same holds true to a hog like this, but we would not want to push those fibers in that initial feeding phase, because they're going to fill up their belly with things that don't allow them to gain. And in her case, the best thing we could have done early on is to drop that protein and encourage her to get fat, and then in the end push that fiber to give her more rib shape. Any questions so far?
Okay, hold on, Krisha. Sorry, I was muted. This slide is stuck at phase 2. Oh, it is not on me, so I don't know what. Maybe that's just theirs. Oh, it says, what is the maximum protein?
You would never want to exceed 22% protein. In that final feeding phase, I would say 22, 23 would be the highest you would want to go. There are some products like Scuds and Final Burst that are high protein and high fat. You can top dress items that offer a little bit of additional kick in protein, but the key is to keep those balanced formulated rations. You probably don't want to utilize starter feeds in the end phases because it's probably going to compromise structure as much as anything, so we want to pay attention to structure. It's kind of a roundabout answer, but.
Perfect, thank you.
Deworming, and this is hugely critical to a nutrition standpoint, guys, because you can go to all the work and do all these other things correctly and then be pretty disappointed with your results if we're feeding something like a parasite. So to be broad spectrum in worming, I personally believe you need to use a feed grade wormer and an injectable. So feed grade dewormers are a little bit challenging to make sure that we've gotten them in there. Safeguard would be that fenbenzanol. So ADM actually has a product now where it's mixed in with the complete feed, so you know you're getting it in there, but you can still use the crystals. There are some pastes that I can't recommend because they're not labeled for swine, but I know people do that as well. But you need to use Safeguard and an injectable. So those injectables would be Ivamec and Dectamax, and I would make sure that you're utilizing wormer every 30 days. Mange in show pigs is one thing that's kind of a hot topic right now. It starts out with those little red dots down around their feet and into their belly, and that can explode into things like a greasy pig, essentially, because it can look like their whole skin is infected. So by controlling parasites like lice, we can help with that. Prolate is a product that you actually mix with a little bit of water, and we can spray that prolate on top of them. It has an awful chemical smell. It is labeled for swine, but parents, I obviously would make sure that you do that and not the kids, because I think it's probably not great to have on you, but it is labeled for swine. But every 30 days, making sure that we're paying attention to the worming side of the aspect.
Okay, we have some questions on worming. Do you use them at the same time? So I think they're referring to the feed and the injectable. Or you alternate, or how do you do that?
I would personally do both every 30 days because, and everybody's probably got a different philosophy on this, but if I'm using a feed grade wormer, I know for sure and for certain that is not going to treat lice. So that's going to help with our internal parasite side of things, but not external. So if you're going to only be able to use one, I would use Dectamax or Ivamec and do the injectable because we know for sure. But if you can do both, I think it would be beneficial.
Okay, the other question is, can you review those injectables again?
Dectamax. And Dectamax is an injectable with a swine label. Make sure that you get the Dectamax that's swine label, and it's not a pour-on, it's an injectable. And then Ivermectin would be the other one. And I know there's a manufacturer back order on Ivamec right now, so it might be a little challenging to get, but Dectamax is currently available.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
So one thing we didn't talk about yet was that you need to be consistent in your feeding times. That consistency is going to help those hogs get kind of on an even keel and gain at an appropriate level. I used this example quite a few times lately, and it really got me thinking when I thought about the amount of time we all spend with this here cell phone. I don't have mine far from me right now, right? And I'm sure all of you don't either. How many times have you left the house and forgot your cell phone? Now, if you're like me, my husband would say that's fairly often. But I can assure you, when I forget my cell phone, I know I have forgotten it and I go back for it because I am attached to that thing, right? Well, that's all a matter of priority. So that cell phone is a big priority to me. I'm not going to leave the house without it. I'm most of the time going to have it with me. Well, the same kind of holds true to our discipline as far as doing the little things and feeding on these hogs. If one day you decide, well, my friends are more important, that's my priority today, I'm not going to feed my pigs, I can assure you, you're going to pay consequences to that. In this initial feeding phase, being off of feed for 15 to 16 hours on small hogs can actually lead to sickness, because there might be a bug there and we've worn down their immune system by not offering that feed to them. So it's all a matter of priorities, but it doesn't take a whole lot of work to be disciplined about your feeding program. And you can see the quote there at the end from Abraham Lincoln kind of sums that up as well. We could talk all night long, guys, about feeding because it can get really, really technical. But like I said, just make sure you've sought out a feed company that has that formulated feed versus just trying to mix your own because of those requirements those pigs have nutritionally. Do we have any other questions, Dawn?
Yes. So for everybody else, as you get questions, if you can unmute yourself, you can ask questions or you can put them in the chat box so we don't miss them. This is back to a worming one. It came up after we'd already advanced, so it's back to worming. It says if you're going to use both of them at the same time, the injectable and the feed additive, you cut the dose in half or you use the full dose?
Yep, they're independent of one another, so give the full recommended dose.
Okay, perfect. All right, there's two more questions that were follow-up. It was a follow-up on how high to put that feeder. If you could just one more explain again how high to put the feeder when you said to have it elevated.
Okay, so at a comfortable level so that it doesn't look uncomfortable for them to eat. So I would say a good rule of thumb is no higher than if they have to tip up onto their front end to get at it. So at a comfortable level, all of those hogs are made so differently that each one's kind of determine where that height is. And the biggest thing is so that if they don't put their head down and their spine doesn't curve, because naturally a good show pig should be level from his tail set to his shoulder. So we don't want the feeder to be so low, this is his head down here where my finger is, that it causes his spine to curve and him to push forward.
Okay. All right, perfect. I have a couple more that are reviews. Is that there was a question, can you just review like how much, so you did this slide on there about how to figure out how much they need to gain, and that tells them really how much they need to eat over the time frame, but how much should they be feeding every day? Like,
yeah, so I think, which slide did I have that on where it was?
Right there.
Right in phase 2, that is full feed. 5 to 6 pounds a day is full feed on a pig. So that'd be 2.5 to 3 morning, 2.5 to 3 p.m. And that's going to get you, ideally, in a perfect world, about 2 pounds a gain. So a pig is 3 to 1 on conversion. So 3 pounds of feed to 1 pound a gain. So that's why that 6 pounds should get us 2. Now, sometimes when we want them to gain that, they don't. And that, again, goes back to their genetic potential. And then sometimes where we're in a situation where we want to hold them, we may cut that back. And so holding a pig, if we have realized that that equation that we did with the math, if we go back to this slide, if we've realized that they're going to be too big, then that's where we need to take into consideration and try to slow that gain down. Their feed companies have holding rations. So those holding rations are comprised of more fiber and hopefully more fortification from a vitamin mineral standpoint. ADM has one called Timeout that is just awesome because you can feed 4 pounds of that 2 morning and 2 p.m. and get 1 pound of gain. So that's going to slow that hog down. So then the idea is to be on an inclining plane of nutrition headed into your show. So if you've held in that second phase from 125 to 200 pounds or even to 250 pounds, hopefully we don't have to hold one that long if we've paid attention to his age and those kind of things. But we want to leave ourselves from 230 to 275 pounds to be on that 5 to 6 pounds of feed again if we can, so that they look fresh. So the grape versus the raisin on freshness.
Okay. Next question says, can you talk about the difference between dry feed versus wet feed? And a second question is, what are your thoughts about putting oil on top of the feed?
Okay, so wet feed versus dry feed. One thing, like our feed is a pelleted feed, it's corn based, so if you wet it down, it breaks up into a mash really well. So the idea of wet feeding is that they might consume more. Also, it's a way to get hydration into those hogs. So if we're going to a show and it's questionable, and I talked about training them to drink at a show, if we're wet feeding that product, we're ensuring we're getting some hydration into them. And then in theory, they should also consume more as well. Hogs are picky, so each one of them has a different palate, similar to humans, especially small children, right, parents? So each one of them may react to that differently as far as wet feeding is concerned. But if we're in a wide open feeding situation where we're trying to put rib and body into a pig, I would definitely suggest that we are wet feeding in that situation.
Okay, what about the oil?
So oil would be one that I would make sure that you're utilizing some sort of formulated oil-based product from a feed company versus just straight corn oil. But there are feed companies that have flaxseed and omega-3 fatty acids in an oil type product that are designed to top dress to offer additional fat cover. One thing to bear in mind when you're feeding fats is that an animal-based fat, like a tallow-based fat, is going to feed with a different texture on the skeleton of your pig versus an oil-based fat. So oils are generally plant-based, so they're going to be soybean oil, like I just said, and flaxseed oil possibly. So that's going to feed with a bloomier, softer fat. The other benefit you're going to get from top dressing a couple ounces of like an oil would be that it's going to cause bloom on your skin and hair also. So it can go hand in hand with what you're doing to externally work on skin and hair, because that is hugely critical, but top dressing that oil can help there. It's going to feed with a softer fat versus something like a more fat, which has some tallow in it. It's going to feed as a harder fat. Also, be mindful that if you're going to feed something like a more fat type product, that it takes 45 days to see results from that. So a lot of people will start with the recommended 2 to 4 ounces, and then they'll think, gosh, my pig is the hard doing type and I really need to get more fat. So they'll just start dumping more and more on, sometimes 4, 8, 16 ounces of fat of feeding. You're just wasting money, because what's going to happen is the villi that are in that stomach to absorb the nutrients are going to slick them down. It's just going to go out the back door. So you're going to have really expensive hog manure. So make sure that we aren't overutilizing those fats.
Okay, next question says, what does it mean to have 9 grams per ton? What does the ton mean?
So that's a science that hopefully the feed company that you're utilizing the Paylean from has predetermined for you. So that's a 9 grams per ton of pig feed. So ton would be 2,000 pounds. So they're going to have that already fixed in there. Do I already have that slide? Fixed in there at that 9 grams per ton for 21 days, or at 4.5 gram level. So for example, we have the product called Lean Maximizer, which is a top dress. On that bucket, it's going to tell you how much of that to feed to be at a 4.5 gram level and how much of it to feed to be at a 9 gram level. Does that make sense?
So basically they need to look at the product they're using and it's going to tell them basically on the bucket.
Yep, absolutely. So feeding instructions are going to tell you how to do that. No company is going to recommend anything but a 9 gram level, because that's all the FDA allows.
Okay, perfect.
And if it's mixed in with your feed, some complete feeds have it mixed in there, it will not exceed 9 grams per ton.
Okay. The next question has to do with oats, beet pulp. How do you feed that in terms to give more body?
Yeah, so we just talked about this gilt right here would be a really good candidate for a beet pulp based type product or an oat groat type product in combination with each other. You're probably going to get as much result from the beet pulp based product that you are from the oat groat. But one thing to be mindful of is just good old beet pulp shreds are fine. But some of these top dress type products that have that in there have that product ground down to a more palatable level than some of those beet pulps that are a little bit coarse. Pigs are kind of finicky, as we discussed earlier, so especially if you're dry feeding, they're going to want to pick through that. Dry and wet feeding, I would recommend for sure, going back to that topic, that we are dry feeding in the initial feeding phases where you're trying to get those pigs to get hungry. At times, albeit very annoying to those that are in our barn, I will mix feed up and intentionally leave it in the bucket and maybe sweep for a second, or I will clean out waters or things like that and leave those hogs a little bit hungry, because we want to build that appetite and make sure that they have that desire to eat. And so starting out with bare basics and dry feeding initially, I think is helpful to do that, whereas we might use that wet feeding to encourage appetite later. And then on a gilt like this, if we're going to want her to consume things that maybe don't taste as good, like a beef pulp type product, that can be beneficial as we move forward.
Okay. So the follow-up is then you would recommend using one of them. It says,
Yes.
do you recommended groats? Okay.
Not every hog though. Oat groats, I would say most hogs can utilize some level of oat groats unless we have a really, really sappy, really, really fat gilt that we don't necessarily need to feed it to, but a couple ounces, yes. Shoats, oat groats, anything like that. Yep, and it can also be beneficial from a digestive standpoint. If we get into a situation where you have a hog that has ulcers, oat groats can be beneficial there also.
So at what point do you start the oat groats with their feed?
I would start in the second feeding phase, 125 pounds.
Okay. So that maybe leads into this next question that popped up, is it says that they've had to change feed a couple times in the last 30 days. So the hogs have really loose stools. Is there anything they can do to firm that back up?
There is a chance if you switched feeds and had to do so even rapidly, that they could have caught a bug that might be causing that. So I would be pretty diligent and pay attention. It might be time to utilize some sort of injectable antibiotic to treat that. I think Ben maybe gave you some ideas there on what you can do. Just going slow with that transition in the future when you have to switch can be very, very helpful. And yeah, you could add in a little bit of oat groats in that situation to try to help their gut with that transition as well.
Okay, next question is that at what point should they take out like an automatic feeder, because you're saying feed as much when they're little as possible and they're using an automatic feeder. At what point do they take that out and start hand feeding?
Yep, so that's going to be at 125 pounds is where we're going to limit feeding, is what we're going to consider that versus the full feed. So at 125 pounds is where we're going to pull that self feeder, or we're going to stop just constantly filling that hanging fence feeder. That's where we're going to start with the 6 pounds per day, is at 125 pounds.
So you don't recommend using that automatic feeder the whole entire time, then you're like telling them to take it out at this point?
Yep, absolutely. At 125 pounds, I would take that self feeder out. There are lots of reasons for it. I talked about the activity levels of the pigs, kind of laying around. Also, this is where we can manage things. So we know that they're consuming that 6 pounds a day. Also, from a health standpoint, we can see exactly how much they're consuming as well.
Okay, let me just look here. There's a question about just some general questions before, as far as that, one question wants to know if they can get a copy of the slide set, or is this something that you prefer not to share?
And you'll share later to the YouTube of it, but
recording.
Yeah, my phone number is here. My email address is my first name. Whoever it is, if you want to email me, we can visit. I can. Go back.
Yep. Okay, perfect. So for that request, just maybe send her an email. Remember, her name is spelled on the email, so it has an A. So, okay, one more question. It says that this is specifically to your company, is that they said that is there someone close to Cody that can give them information on, oh, they're in Cody and they're looking for a distributor in Southwest Wyoming. Is there somebody that sells Mormon in Southwest Wyoming? Oh, they found one in Cody. Sorry to read the whole thing. They found a dealer in Cody. Is there a dealer in Southwest Wyoming?
We have a dealer locator, as all feed companies do. So on the dealer locator, you can put in your zip code and it will bring up somebody close to you. But again, if you just want to call me with that question, I can help you there. I think Matt David would be a distributor that might be close to you. But I can see if you just want to give me a text or a call, I can help you with that one.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I think I've got them all. I tried to write them down and go back to them if we missed them as we went along and you guys asked them. So I think that I'm caught up in the chat box. So this is kind of your time. Does anybody else have any questions? You sure can unmute yourself. I don't have to be the one to ask, but you can unmute yourselves, ask questions, or put them in the chat box. One final thought process. Does anybody else have questions? All right. All right, so I guess if not, I'm going to stop recording here for a minute.